Now, let's take a look at the next slide here. Can I get a volunteer to read this aloud? Go ahead.
If the known relation between the variables consists of the corresponding values, the graph consists only of the corresponding stylized things. If the variables are known to vary continuously, one often draws a very short variation.
Does anybody want to tell me what that means? Not you. Does anybody know what it means? Raise your hand. I promise I won't pick on you. Just raise your hand if you know what it means. Now, is there a single word in here that you don't understand? Like the longest word in here is corresponding or continuously, maybe? We all know what those words mean. And this grammar is totally consistent with the language we speak all the time, every day. Is there anything wrong with the verbal structure of this paragraph? Nothing. But it made no sense at all. Now, it seems clear they're talking about math, they're talking about graphing points. If they had an illustration, if they had equations, all sorts of non-verbal cues, we could make sense out of it. This is important. But I wanted originally to juxtapose this with the Jabberwocky because even though they're trying to accomplish very different things, within the context of this lecture, we don't know what this is talking about. It's perfectly perfect language, perfect verbal communication, whereas the Jabberwocky is seemingly wrong in every way verbal communication could be wrong, and yet, well, lots of people, and I personally feel that I understand it, and I don't necessarily understand a particular right, correct interpretation of it, but the mission is accomplished from the poet's point of view, I think. Now, what does this mean for us in the classroom, or even in daily life? You know, verbal communication is a discipline. It's a practice that you have to be familiar with. And I mentioned earlier, you know, your kids students aren't going to speak the exact same way that you do. Do you ever have an adult, a teacher, or maybe one of your parents, or someone who actually tried to speak the way that the kids did, and it was just embarrassing, it was ridiculous? How many people have a memory of someone like that in their lives? Just about everybody has experienced that. And I'm assuming that none of you wants to be that in front of your students. The guy who, you know, tries to be one of the kids, tries to talk that way, and just, it fails, it looks ridiculous. You don't have to talk exactly the way that they do in order for them to understand you or even respond to you. You know, I've lived mostly far away from here my whole life, so I'm probably not speaking exactly the same way that you folks would. But you all understand me perfectly, and I understand all of you. And go ahead and move to the next slide. This is a quote by Bruce Lee. Everyone knows who Bruce Lee is, right? Do not deny the classical approach simply as a reaction, or you will create another pattern and trap yourself there. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you translate that. He's saying you cannot transcend form until you master form. And he said this in response to a young adept in his, I don't know what they're called, I don't think they're called dojos, but wherever he was training people, this young guy came up to him and basically said, Master Lee, you know, I don't understand why I have to learn all these ridiculous forms, all these formalisms for the art of Kung Fu. When you fight, you don't use these traditional forms. You're fluid and you respond dynamically. And what you do is simply not what we're being taught here. And what Bruce Lee told them was basically, you know, you might think that's true, and there might be some truth in it. There might be an inflexibility in understanding the particulars of Kung Fu, and where this applies to language is grammar and spelling and word usage. You know, these strictly formal rules might not be enough to make you accessible to your students, but you're not going to be able to just skip them. Because if you don't master form, you don't jump to being Bruce Lee, you're just going to be some idiot flailing around in the middle of the mat. And language is the same way. If you don't know what it is you're working with well enough to understand and appreciate when you can transcend it, when you can depart from that tradition, you're not going to do it well. You're not going to succeed. Now, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to cover the wide variety of the spectrum of points about verbal communication that I would need to in order to really give you an understanding of it. And the 2 points that the book takes out to discuss, the time management and the positive language, I don't think those are really adequate to give you a complete understanding of what's important. So the only thing I can tell you is read. Read for fun. If you don't like reading, make yourself like it. Because the only way you will learn to be a good, skilled verbal communicator is by experiencing verbal communication constantly, frequently, and with variety. You know, I love Stephen King novels, but if you just read Stephen King novels, you're just going to end up talking like Stephen King. If you read C.S. Forster's Horatio Hornblower novels, they're talking about ridiculous naval terminology that you'll never use from 19th century England in a manner that you're not going to speak. But by learning to follow the story through that perspective, through that division between you, that language barrier, you will exercise that part of your mind that makes useful concepts out of language. You will become stronger in understanding how language does and doesn't work. And that's what you need to do. That's what you need to do. So go out there, read, write, talk, listen. I don't know all of you individually. I don't know how skilled you are or aren't with language, but this is something you're going to have to do, because as I pointed out at the beginning, nonverbal communication is necessary to make good verbal communication good enough, but it is not sufficient to save bad verbal communication. If your ideas are not being articulated properly in the first place, no amount of slides or gestures or in skillful use of inflection is going to salvage it. You have to start with that first. I don't feel that message is conveyed by the book. Maybe I'm not doing it justice. This is, after all, my opinion, but I feel very strongly about that, and I think that that's going to serve you well as you go on in your career as a teacher.